Just turn around and leave me. The tear in my eye drops on the floor alongside my spear. My knees are drenched in the blood I spilled just to get here. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. I never pray to God anymore. I'd rather no one hurt me. Redemption, I have waited for you to come and drown all my sin. My knees are drenched in the blood I spilled just to get here. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. I don't wanna fight anymore. Just turn around and leave me. The tear in my eye drops on the floor alongside my spear. My knees are drenched in the blood I spilled just to get here. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way.
All right, let's get started here, shall we? Okay, looks like my sound is working okay. All right, so starting a new series of reading tonight. I don't know that I will do exclusively Forgotten Realms books on this for the Wednesday readings. I mean, obviously, everything in this playlist that will end up on YouTube will be Forgotten Realms, but I may alternate between Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance just because I might. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. Um, haven't even gotten into the first book yet. So, um, like many people, my first introduction to Forgotten Realms, because I wasn't a D&D player back in the day, I was a Rollmaster player. Um, my first introduction was the Dark Elf Trilogy. Um, and I know a lot of people recommend reading the Icewind Dale Trilogy and then going back and reading the Dark Elf Trilogy, because it's a prequel, so on and so forth. I started with the Dark Elf Trilogy, so I'm going to start with the Dark Elf Trilogy. So, that being said, here we go. We are going to start into Homeland, the very first book in that trilogy. So, Part 1, Station. Station. In all the worlds of the drow, depends on who you are. I kind of alternate between, or just, randomly. I'll probably say drow more than anything. There is no more important word. It is the calling of their or our religion, the incessant pulling of hungering heartstrings. Ambition overrides good sense, and compassion is thrown away in its face, all in the name of Loth, the Spider Queen. Ascension to power in drow, I'm going to say drow, is a simple process of assassination. The Spider Queen is a deity of chaos, and she and her high priestesses, the true rulers of the drow world, do not look with ill favor upon ambitious individuals wielding poisoned daggers. Of course, there are rules of behavior every society must boast of these. To openly commit murder or wage war invites the pretense of justice, and penalties exacted in the name of drow justice are merciless. To stick a dagger in the back of a rival during the chaos of a larger battle, or in the quiet shadows of an alley, however, is quite acceptable, even applauded. Investigation is not the forte of drow justice. No one cares enough to bother. Station is the way of Loth, the ambition she bestows to further the chaos, to keep her drow children along their appointed course of self-imprisonment. Children? Pawns, more like, dancing dolls for the Spider Queen. Puppets on the imperceptible but impervious strands of her web. All climb the Spider Queen's ladders, all hunt for her pleasure, and all fall to the hunters of her pleasure. Station is the paradox of the world of my people, the limitation of our power within the hunger for power. It is gained through treachery and invites treachery against those who gain it. Those most powerful in Menzoberranzan spend their days watching over their shoulders, defending against the daggers that would find their backs. Their deaths usually come from the front. Drizzt Do'Urden. I used to pronounce it Dritz, even though the T comes after the Z's. I don't anymore. I say Drizzt. So, anyway, Part 1, Chapter 1, Menzoberranzan. To a surface dweller, he might have passed undetected only a foot away. The padded footfalls of his lizard mount were too light to be heard, and the pliable and perfectly crafted mesh armor that both rider and mount wore bent and creased with their movements as well as if the suits had grown over their skin. The Dinins, I'm going to say Dinins, D-I-N-I-N apostrophe S. The Dinan's lizard trotted along in an easy but swift gait, floating over the broken floor, up the walls, and even across the long tunnel ceiling. Subterranean lizards, with their sticky and soft, three-toed feet, were preferred mounts for just this ability to scale stone as easily as a spider. Crossing hard ground left no damning tracks in the lighted surface world, but nearly all of the creatures of the Underdark possessed infravision. the ability to see in the infrared spectrum. Footfalls left heat residue that could easily be tracked if they followed a predictable course along a corridor's floor. Dynan clamped tight to his saddle as the lizard plodded along a stretch of the ceiling, then sprang out in a twisting descent to a point further along the wall. Dynan did not want to be tracked. He had no light to guide him, but he needed none. He was a dark elf, a drow, an ebon-skinned cousin of those sylvan folk who danced under the stars on the world's surface. To Dynan's superior eyes, which translated subtle variations of heat into vivid and colorful images, the Underdark was far from a lightless place. Colors all across the spectrum swirled before him in the stone of the walls and the floor, heated by some distant fissure or hot stream. The heat of living things was the most distinctive, letting the dark elf view his enemies in details as intricate as any surface dweller would find in brilliant daylight. Normally, Dynan would not have left the city alone. The world of the Underdark was too dangerous for solo treks, even for a drow elf. This day was different, though. Dynan had to be certain that no unfriendly drow eyes marked his passage. A soft blue magical glow behind a sculpted archway told the drow that he neared the city's entrance, and he slowed the lizard's pace accordingly. Few used this narrow tunnel, which opened into Tir Brichet. I'll say Brichet. Tir Brichet, the northern section of Menzoberranzan, devoted to the academy, and none but the mistresses and masters, the instructors of the academy, could pass through here without attracting suspicion. Dynan was always nervous when he came to this point. Of the 100 tunnels that opened off the main cavern of Menzoberranzan, this one was the best guarded. Beyond the archway, twin statues of gigantic spiders sat in quiet defense. If an enemy crossed through, the spiders would animate and attack, and alarms would be sounded all throughout the academy. Dynan dismounted, leaving his lizard clinging comfortably to a wall at his chest level. He reached under the collar of his puafwi, his magical shielding cloak, and took out his neck purse. From this, Dynan produced the insignia of House Do'Urden, a spider wielding various weapons in each of his 8 legs, and emblazoned with the letters DN for Dermon na Azshbernon, the ancient and formal name of House Do'Urden. "You will await my return," Din whispered to the lizard, as he waved the insignia before it. As with all the drow houses, the insignia of House Do'Urden held several magical dweimers, or dwomers, some people may say. I say dweimers. One of which gave family members absolute control over the house pets. The lizard would obey unfailingly, holding its position as though it were rooted to the stone, even if a scurry rat, its favorite morsel, napped a few feet from its maw. Dynan took a deep breath and gingerly stepped to the archway. He could see the spiders leering down at him from their 15-foot height. He was a drow of the city, not an enemy, and could pass through any other tunnel unconcerned. But the academy was an unpredictable place. Dynan had heard that the spiders often refused entry viciously, even to uninvited drow. He could not be delayed by fears and possibilities. Dynan reminded himself his business was of the utmost importance to his family's battle plans. Looking straight ahead, away from the towering spiders, he strode between them and onto the floor of Tir Brichet. He moved to the side and paused, first to be certain that no one lurked nearby, and then to admire the sweeping view of Menzoberranzan. No one, drow or otherwise, had ever looked out from this spot without a sense of wonder at the drow city. Tir Brichet was the highest point on the floor of the 2-mile cavern, affording a panoramic view to the rest of Menzoberranzan. The cubby of the academy was narrow, holding only the 3 structures that comprised the drow school. Arak Tinalith, the spider-shaped school of Loth, Sorcerer, the gracefully curved, many-spired Tower of Wizardry, and Melee Magthir, the somewhat plain pyramidal structure between where male fighters learned their trade. Beyond Tir Brochet, through the ornate stalagmite columns that marked the entrance to the academy, the cavern dropped away quickly and spread wide, going far beyond Dynan's line of vision to either side and further back than his keen senses could possibly see. The colors of Menzoberranzan were threefold to the sensitive eyes of the drow. Heat patterns from various fissures and hot springs swirled about the entire cavern. Purple and red, bright yellow and subtle blue, crossed and merged, climbed the walls and stalagmite mounds, or ran off singularly in cutting lines against the backdrop of dim gray stone. More confined than these generalized and natural gradations of color in the infrared spectrum were the regions of intense magic, like the spiders Dynan had walked between, virtually glowing with energy. Finally, there were the actual lights of the city, fairy fire and highlighted sculptures on the houses. The drow were proud of the beauty of their designs, and especially ornate columns or perfectly crafted gargoyles were almost always limed in permanent magical lights. Even from this distance, Dynan could make out House Bainre, first house of Menzoberranzan. It encompassed 20 stalagmite pillars and half again that number of gigantic stalactites. House Bainre had existed for 5,000 years since the founding of Menzoberranzan, and in that time the work to perfect the house's art had never ceased. Practically every inch of the immense structure glowed in fairy fire, blue at the outlying towers and brilliant purple at the huge central dome. The sharp light of candles, foreign to the Underdark, glared through some of the windows of the distant houses. Only clerics or wizards would light the fires. Dynan knew, as necessary pains in their world of scrolls and parchments. This was Menzoberranzan, the city of drow. Threnti, I think that's a typo. 20,000 dark elves lived there. 20,000 soldiers in the army of evil. A wicked smile spread across Dynan's thin lips when he thought of some of those soldiers who would fall this night. Dynan studied Narbondel, the huge central pillar that served as the time clock of Menzoberranzan. Narbondel was the only way the drow had to mark the passage of time in a world that otherwise knew no days and no seasons. At the end of each day, the city's appointed archmage cast his magical fires into the base of the stone pillar. There the spell lingered throughout the cycle, a full day on the surface, and gradually spread its warmth up the structure of Narbondel until the whole of it glowed red in the infrared spectrum. The pillar was fully dark now, cooled since the Dwemer's fires had expired. The wizard was even now, at the base. Dynan reasoned, ready to begin the cycle anew. It was midnight, the appointed hour. Dynan moved away from the spiders and the tunnel exit and crept along the side of Tir Brochet, seeking the shadows of heat patterns in the wall, which would effectively hide the distinct outline of his own body temperatures. He came at last to Sorcerer, the school of wizardry, and slipped into the narrow alley between the tower's curved base and Tir Brochet's outer wall. "Student or master," came the expected whisper. "Only a master may walk out of house in Tir Brochet in the black death of Narbondel," Dynan responded. A heavily robed figure moved around the arc of the structure to stand before Dynan. The stranger remained in the customary posture of a master of the Drow Academy, his arms out before him and bent at the elbows, his hands tight together, one on top of the other in front of his chest. That pose was the only thing about this one that seemed normal to Dynan. "Greetings, faceless one," he signaled in the silent hand code of the drow, a language as detailed as the spoken word. The quiver of Dynan's hands belied his calm face, though for the sight of this wizard put him as far on the edge of his nerves as he had ever been. "Second boy Do'Urden," the wizard replied in gestured code. "Have you my payment?" "You will be compensated," Dynan signaled pointedly, regaining his composure in the first swelling bubbles of his temper. "Do you dare to doubt the promise of Malus Do'Urden, matron mother of Dermon na Shesbernon, 10th house of Menzoberranzan?" The faceless one slumped back, knowing he had erred. "My apologies, second boy of House Do'Urden," he answered, dropping to one knee in a gesture of surrender. Since he had entered this conspiracy, the wizard had feared that his impatience might cost him his life. He had been caught in the violent throes of one of his own magical experiments, the tragedy melting away all of his facial features and leaving behind a blank hot spot of white and green goo. Matron Malus Do'Urden, reputedly as skilled as anyone in all the vast city in mixing potions and salves, had offered him a sliver of hope that he could not pass by. No pity found its way into Dynan's callous heart, but House Do'Urden needed the wizard. "You will get your salve," Dynan promised calmly, "when Alton de Vere is dead." "Of course," the wizard agreed. "This night?" Dynan crossed his arms and considered the question. Matron Malice had instructed him that Alton de Vere should die even as their family's battle commenced. That scenario now seemed too clean, too easy to Dynan. The faceless one did not miss the sparkle that suddenly brightened the scarlet glow in the young Do'Urden's heat-sensing eyes. "Wait for Narbendel's light to approach its zenith," Dynan replied, his hands working through the signals excitedly, and his grimace seeming more of a twisted grin. "Should the doomed boy know of his house's fate before he dies?" the wizard asked, guessing the wicked intentions behind Dynan's instructions. "As the killing blow falls," answered Dynan, "let Alton de Vere die without hope." Dynan retrieved his mount and sped off down the empty corridors, finding an intersecting route that would take him in through a different entrance to the city proper. He came in along the eastern end of the great cavern, Menzoberranzan's produce section, where no drow families would see that he had been outside the city limits, and where only a few unremarkable stalagmite pillars rose up from the flat stone. Dynan spurred his mount along the banks of Donegarden, the city's small pond, with its moss-covered island that housed a fair-sized herd of cattle-like creatures called roth. 100 goblins and orcs looked up from their herding and fishing duties to mark the drow's soldiers' swift passage. Knowing their restriction as slaves, they took care not to look Dynan in the eye. Dynan would have paid them no heed anyway. He was too consumed by the urgency of the moment. He kicked his lizard to even greater speeds when he again was on the flat and curving avenues between the glowing drow castles. He moved toward the south-central region of the city, toward the grove of giant mushrooms that marked the section of the finest houses in Menzoberranzan. As he came around one blind turn, he nearly ran over a group of 4 wandering bugbears. The giant hairy goblin things paused a moment to consider the drow, then moved slowly but purposefully out of his way. The bugbears recognized him as a member of House Do'Urden, Dynan knew. He was a noble, a son of a high priestess, and his surname, Do'Urden, was the name of his house. Of the 20,000 dark elves in Menzoberranzan, only 1,000 or so were nobles, actually the children of the 67 recognized families of the city. The rest were common soldiers. Bugbears were not stupid creatures. They knew a noble from a commoner, and though drow elves did not carry their family insignia in plain view, the pointed and tailed cut of Dynan's stark white hair and the distinctive pattern of purple and red lines in his black puafui told them well enough who he was. The mission's urgency pressed upon Dynan, but he could not ignore the bugbear's slight. How fast would they have scampered away if he had been a member of House Bainre, or one of the other 7 ruling houses, he wondered. "You will learn respect of House Do'Urden soon enough," the Dark Elf whispered under his breath, as he turned and charged his lizard at the group. The bugbears broke into a run, turning down on an alley strewn with stone and debris. Dynan found his satisfaction by calling on the innate powers of his race. He summoned a globe of darkness impervious to both infravision and normal sight in the fleeing creature's path. He supposed that it was unwise to call such attention to himself, but a moment later, when he heard crashing and sputtered curses as the bugbears stumbled blindly over the stones, he felt it was worth the risk. His anger sated, he moved off again, picking a more careful route through the heat shadows. As a member of the 10th house of the city, Dynan could go as he pleased within the giant cavern without question, but Matron Malice had made it clear that no one connected to House Do'Urden was to be caught anywhere near the mushroom grove. Matron Malice, Dynan's mother, was not to be crossed, but it was only a rule, after all. In Menzoberranzan, one rule took precedence over all of the petty others. Don't get caught. At the mushroom grove's southern end, the impetuous drow found that what he was looking for, a cluster of 5 huge floor-to-ceiling pillars that were hollowed into a network of chambers and connected with metal and stone parapets and bridges. Red glowing gargoyles, the standard of the house, glared down from 100 perches like silent sentries. This was House de Vere, 4th house of Menzoberranzan. A stockade of tall mushrooms ringed the place. Everywhere, every 5th one a shrieker, a sentient fungus named and favored as guardians, for the shrill cries of alarm it emitted whenever a living being passed it by. Dynan kept a cautious distance, not wanting to set off one of the shriekers, and knowing also that other, more deadly wards protected the fortress. Matron Malice would see to those. An expectant hush permeated the air of this city section. It was general knowledge throughout Menzoberranzan that Matron Guinevere of House de Vere had fallen out of favor with Lolth, the Spider Queen, deity of all drow, and the true source of every house's strength. Such circumstances were never openly discussed among the drow, but everyone who knew fully expected that some family lower in the city hierarchy soon would strike out against the crippled House de Vere. Matron Guinevere and her family had been the last to learn of the Spider Queen's displeasure ever was that Lolth's devious way, and Dynan could tell just by scanning the outside of House de Vere that the doomed family had not found ample time to erect proper defenses. De Vere sported nearly 400 soldiers, many female, but those that Dynan could now see at their posts along the parapets seemed nervous and unsure. Dynan's smile spread even wider when he thought of his own house, which grew in power daily under the cunning guidance of Matron Malice. With all 3 of his sisters rapidly approaching the status of high priestess, his brother an accomplished wizard, and his uncle Zaknafine, the finest weapon master in all of Menzoberranzan, busily training the 300 soldiers House Do'Urden was a complete force, and Matron Malice, unlike Guinevere, was in the Spider Queen's full favor. Dermon Naashesbernon, Dynan muttered under his breath, using the formal and ancestral reference to House Do'Urden, 9th house of Menzoberranzan. He liked the sound of it. Halfway across the city, beyond the silver-glowing balcony and the arched doorway 20 feet up the cavern's west wall, sat the principals of House Do'Urden, gathered to outline the final plans of the night's work. On the raised dais at the back of the small audience chamber sat venerable Matron Malice, her belly swollen in the final hours of pregnancy. Flanking her in their places of honor were her 3 daughters, Maya, Virna, and the eldest, Briza, a newly ordained high priestess of Lolth. Maya and Virna appeared as younger versions of their mother, slender and deceptively small, though possessing great strength. Briza, though hardly carried the family resemblance. She was big What? There's a typo here. Sorry. I'm gonna just say big, because I can't make out the rest. She was. Oh, I know what it's supposed to be. She was big, huge by drow standards, and rounded in the shoulders and hips. Those who knew Brizo well figured that her size was merely a circumstance of her temperament. A smaller body could not have contained the anger and brutal streak of House Do'Urden's newest high priest. Dynan should return soon, remarked Risen, the present patron of the family, to let us know of the time, if the time is right for the assault. We go before Norbandel finds its morning glow, Briza snapped at him in her thick but razor-sharp voice. She turned a crooked smile to her mother, seeking approval for putting the mail in his place. The child comes this night, Matron Malice explained to her anxious husband. We go no matter what news Dynan bears. It will be a boy child, groaned Briza, making no effort to hide her disappointment. Third living son of House Do'Urden. To be sacrificed to Loth, put in Zaknafine, a former patron of the house, who now held the important position of weapon master. The skilled drow fighter, another typo here, seemed quite pleased at the thought of sacrifice, as did Nelfine, the family's eldest son, who stood at Zak's side. Nalfine was the elder boy, and he needed no more competition beyond Dynan within the ranks of House Do'Urden. In accord with custom, Briza glowered, and the red of her eyes brightened. To aid in our victory, Risen shifted uncomfortably. Matron Malice, he dared to speak. You know well the difficulties of birthing. Might the pain distract you? You dare to question the matron mother, Briza started sharply, reaching for the snake-headed whip, so comfortably strapped and writhing on her belt. Matron Malice stopped her with an outstretched hand. Attend to the fighting, the matron said to Risen. Let the females of the house see to the important matters of this battle. Risen shifted again and dropped his gaze. Dynan came to the magically wrought fence that connected the keep within the city's west wall with the two small stalagmite towers of House Do'Urden, and which formed the courtyard to the compound. The fence was adamantite, the hardest metal in all the world, and adorning it were 100 weapon-wielding spider carvings, each ensorcelled with deadly glyphs and wards. The mighty gate of House Do'Urden was the envy of many a drow house, but so soon after viewing the spectacular houses in the mushroom grove, Dynan could only find disappointment when looking upon his own abode. The compound was plain and somewhat bare, as was the section of wall, with the notable exception of the mithril and adamantite balcony running along the second level, by the arched doorway reserved for the nobility of the family. Each baluster of that balcony sported 1,000 carvings, all of which blended into a single piece of art. House Do'Urden, unlike the great majority of the houses in Menzoberranzan, did not stand free within groves of stalagmites and stalactites and stalagmites. The bulk of the structure was within a cave, and while this setup was indisputably defensible, Dynan found himself wishing that his family could show a bit more grandeur. An excited soldier rushed to open the gate for the returning second boy. Dynan swept past him without so much as a word of greeting, and moved across the courtyard, conscious of the 100 and more curious glances that fell upon him. The soldiers and slaves knew that Dynan's mission this night had something to do with the anticipated battle. No stairway led to the silver balcony of House Do'Urden's second level. This, too, was a precautionary measure designed to segregate the leaders of the house from the rabble and the slaves. Drow nobles needed no stairs. Another manifestation of their innate magical abilities allowed them the power of levitation. With hardly a conscious thought to the act, Dynan drifted easily through the air and dropped onto the balcony. He rushed through the archway and down the house's main central corridor, which was dimly lit in the soft hues of fairy fire, allowing for sight in the normal light spectrum, but not bright enough to defeat the use of infravision. The ornate brass door at the corridor's end marked the second boy's destination, and he paused before it to allow his eyes to shift back to the infrared spectrum. Unlike the corridor, the room beyond the door had no light source. It was the audience hall of the High Priestesses, the anteroom to House Do'Urden's Grand Chapel. The drow clerical rooms, in accord with the dark rites of the Spider Queen, were not places of light. When he felt he was prepared, Dynan pushed straight through the door, shoving past the two shocked female guards without hesitation, and moving boldly to stand before his mother. All three of the family daughters narrowed their eyes at their brash and pretentious brother. "You enter without permission," he knew they were thinking. Would that it was he who was to be sacrificed this night. As much as he enjoyed testing the limitations of his inferior station as a male, Dynan could not ignore the threatening glances of Virna, Maya, and Briza. Being female, they were bigger and stronger than Dynan, and had trained all of their lives in the use of wicked drow clerical powers and weapons. Dynan watched as enchanted extensions of the clerics, the dreaded snake-headed whips on his sister's belts, began writhing in anticipation of the punishment they would exact. The handles were adamantite, and ordinary enough, but the whip's lengths and multiple heads were living serpents. Briza's whip in particular, a wicked six-headed device, danced and squirmed, tying itself into knots around the belt that held it. Briza was always the quickest to punish. Matron Malice, however, seemed pleased by Dynan's swagger. The second boy knew his place well enough by her measure, and he followed her commands fearlessly and without question. Dynan took comfort in the calmness of his mother's face, quite the opposite of the shining, white-hot faces of his three sisters. "All is ready," he said to her. "House de Vere huddles within its fence except for Alton, of course, foolishly attending his studies in Sorcerer." "You have met with the Faceless One?" Matron Malice asked. "The Academy was quiet this night," Dynan replied. "Our meeting went off perfectly." "He has agreed to our contract? Alton de Vere will be dealt with accordingly," Dynan chuckled. He then remembered the slight alteration he had made in Matron Malice's plans, delaying Alton's execution for the sake of his own lust for added cruelty. Dynan's thought evoked another recollection as well. High priestesses of Loth had an unnerving talent for reading thoughts. "Alton will die this night," Dynan quickly completed the answer, assuring the others before they could probe him for more definite details. "Excellent," Briza growled. Dynan breathed a little easier. "To the meld," Matron Malice ordered. The four drow males moved to kneel before the matron and her daughters. Risen to Malice, Zaknafine to Briza, Nalfine to Maya, and Dynan to Virna. The clerics chanted in unison, placing one hand delicately upon the forehead of their respective soldier, tuning in to his passions. "You know your places," Matron Malice said when the ceremony was completed. She grimaced through the pain of another contraction. "Let our work begin." Less than an hour later, Zaknafine and Briza stood together on the balcony outside the upper entrance to House Do'Urden. Below them, on the cavern floor, the 2nd and 3rd Brigades of the family army, Rizens and Nalfines, bustled about, fitting on heated leather straps and metal patches, camouflage against a distinctive elven form to heat-seeing drow eyes. Dynan's group, the initial strike force that included 100 goblin slaves, had long since departed. We will be known after this night," Briza said. "None would have suspected that a 10th house would dare to move against one as powerful as de Vere. When the whispers ripple out after this night's bloody work, even Bainre will take note of Dermon na Ashesbernan." She leaned out over the balcony to watch the two brigades formed into lines and started out, silently, along separate paths that would bring them through the winding city to the mushroom grove and the 5-pillared structure of House de Vere. Zaknafine eyed the back of Matron Malice's eldest daughter, wanting nothing more than to put a dagger into her spine. As always, though, good judgment kept Zack's practiced hand in its place. "Have you the articles?" Briza inquired, showing Zack considerably more respect than she had when Matron Malice sat protectively at her side. Zack was only a male, a commoner, allowed to don the family name as his own because he sometimes served Matron Malice in a husbandly manner and had once been the patron of the house. Still, Briza feared to anger him. Zack was the weapon master of House Do'Urden, a tall and muscular male, stronger than most females, and those who had witnessed his fighting wrath considered him among the finest warriors of either sex in all of Menzoberranzan. Besides Briza and her mother, both high priestesses of the Spider Queen, Zaknafine, with his unrivaled swordsmanship, was House Do'Urden's trump. Zack held up the black hood and opened the small pouch on his belt, revealing several tiny ceramic spheres. Briza smiled evilly and rubbed her slender hands together. "Matron Guinevere will not be pleased," she whispered. Zack returned the smile and turned to view the departing soldiers. Nothing gave the weapon master more pleasure than killing drow elves, particularly clerics of Loth. "Prepare yourself," Briza said after a few minutes. Zack shook his thick hair back from his face and stood rigid, eyes tightly closed. Briza drew her wands slowly, beginning the chant that would activate the device. She tapped Zack on one shoulder, then the other, then held the wand motionless over his head. Zack felt the frosty sprinkles falling down on him, permeating his clothes and armor, even his flesh, until he and all of his possessions had cooled to a uniform temperature and hue. Zack hated the magical chill. It felt as he imagined death would feel, but he knew that under the influence of the wand's sprinkles he was, to the heat-sensing eyes of the creatures of the Underdark, as gray as common stone, unremarkable and undetectable. Zack opened his eyes and shuddered, flexing his fingers to be sure they could still perform the fine edge of his craft. He looked back to Briza, already in the midst of the second spell, the summoning. This one would take a while, so Zack leaned back against the wall and considered again the pleasant though dangerous task before him. How thoughtful of Matron Malice to leave all of House de Vere's clerics to him. "It is done," Briza announced after a few minutes. She led Zack's gaze upward to the darkness beneath the unseen ceiling of the immense cavern. Zack spotted Briza's handiwork first, an approaching current of air, yellow-tinted and warmer than the normal air of the cavern, a living current of air. The creature, a conjuration from an elemental plane, swirled to hover just beyond the tip of the balcony, obediently awaiting its summoner's commands. Zack didn't hesitate. He leaped out into the thing's midst, letting it hold him suspended above the floor. Briza offered him a final salute and motioned her servant away. "Good fighting," she called to Zack, though he was already invisible in the air above her. Zack chuckled at the irony of her words as the twisting city of Menzoberranzan rolled out below him. She wanted the cries of House de Vere She wanted the clerics of House de Vere dead as surely as Zack did, but for very different reasons. All complications aside, Zack would have been just as happy killing clerics of House Do'Urden. The weapon master took up one of his adamantite swords, a drow weapon magically crafted and unbelievably sharp, with the edge of killing Dwemer's. "Good fighting indeed," he whispered, if only Briza knew how good. And that is the end of the first chapter, and I am actually going to end it there, because that took an hour, I think. Is that where we're at? Yeah, we're at 45 minutes, and I can already feel my voice is starting to go. So we will leave it off there, and let's see who is around. Well, you know what? No, I'm not going to raid tonight. I'm just going to call it. So I will see you all in the next one.
I'm just calling to say I... I'm just calling to say I...